I'm David Bloom, head of the urology department here at the University of Michigan, and I want to welcome everyone here. Thank you all so much for coming. Audience, first and foremost, this is the 11th year that we've done this. I'll tell you a little bit about it shortly. But we call this the Chang Lecture in Art and Medicine in honor of Dr. Chang, who's here with us today. His family, Hamilton and Ted and the Bakers, and a few grandchildren, which is a wonderful thing. And no family embodies art and medicine much better than the Changs. Ted and his father were both U of M urologists trained here. And Dr. Chang's father, Kunyan Chang, was a famous painter in China in those difficult times transitioning from the mainland to Taiwan now. And one of the Chang pictures I'll show you in a minute is on display over at the Art Museum. And I want to welcome our Chang lecturer this year, Dr. David Watts, and his wife Joan Baranow and their son Gabriel, who came all the way from UCSF for this talk, and a little bit more about Dr. Watts shortly. And if you get a chance during the art fair, wander over to the Art Museum, then go upstairs on the third floor, go to the Shirley Chang wing, and you'll see some lovely things, including a large landscape of Kunyan Chang. One of many, I think they have 35 or so pictures there. Dr. Watts is gastroenterologist, professor at UCSF, Parnassus poet, author, musician, inventor, NPR commentator, and also Harvey Ellis. And I don't know if he'll tell you about that or not. So welcome again, Dr. Watts. Come down here and tell us what's on your mind. And thank you all again for coming.
I see it as my task in talking about love, words, and medicine to celebrate the power of words to do good in the world. But more than that, and germane to our concern here as healthcare providers, is the power of the words to actually heal. And that may be a bit of a stretch, but we're going to have fun with that today as I'm talking about it. And I'm speaking specifically of the use of words in a well-selected, well-crafted manner that forms poems and stories. Because there's something about poems and stories that goes beyond just beauty and entertainment, though that is also quite justified as a reason to have them. But when it's assembled properly and when it's written well, it has an almost magical quality to it, which shows us a way of living with grace in a difficult world. So what I'm going to do is begin the talk just by reciting a couple of poems for you. These poems are on the subject of love, and there are a couple of reasons for the poems and a couple of reasons for the subject. First of all, I want to set the tone, because I am going to use poetry and stories as a part of this presentation along the way. And secondly, I chose the subject of love because it's what holds it all together. So here's the first poem, and it's called This Love. This love is as good as oil and honey to the throat, as linen to the body, as incense to the worshipers as they enter in, as raiments to the gods. It is a ripe pear in a man's hand. It is the little seal ring on my finger. It is the dates we mix with wine. It is the seeds the baker adds to bread. We will be together until old age comes, and all the days in between shall be as food set before us, dates and honey, bread and wine. So a poem like that, you could think, well, it might have been written yesterday, 5 years ago, 100 years ago, 3,200 years ago. It was unearthed in Egypt, written in cuneiform on the wall of a vase, probably intended as a marriage poem to be sung or to be said. And it's exciting to me because, for a couple of reasons, and you will find your own, and that's the magic of poetry, is it speaks to everyone at their own level of interpretation and knowledge and hunger. But to me, it was exciting because it showed that they already knew how to expand language. Language is imperfect. It does its best to try to describe to us the things that we want to have described, to name things, to put an attachment on things that mean something to us. But language can't tell you everything about that rock that you have in your hand. So we have figured out, writers and poets, ways of expanding language. And one of those ways is to use simile or metaphor. And so you say, poetry, love. How can we describe love? If I ask you in the audience, what is love? It's very difficult to know exactly. We can say things about it, but here's the way that the ancient Egyptians 3,200 years ago did it, by using simile. It's like this, it's like this, it's like this, and you add it up and you get a closer idea. So, and the second thing about it is now, I mean, we don't need affirmation of this necessarily, but love has been around forever, right? It wasn't something that was invented by the troubadours in the 13th century. It's been here. So, okay, second poem I'm going to recite is from Thomas Tranströmer, who's a Swedish poet, Nobel laureate, who wrote this poem, and it has elements to it that I think you'll find very interesting. It's called Fire Scribbling, intended to mean sitting by the fireside and writing. During the dismal months, my life sparkled only when I made love to you. As a firefly ignites and goes out, ignites, goes out. One can trace its flight by glimpses in the night among the olive trees. During the dismal months, the soul sat shrunken and lifeless. But the body took the straight path to you. The night sky bellowed. By stealth, we milked the cosmos and survived. I think it's a really powerful poem. It uses a very few words to describe something that he was going through. We don't know if it's illness or depression or something financial, we don't know. And it really doesn't matter, because it was for him what he calls the dismal months. And the only way he could survive, stay alive, stay cognizant, stay working, was to be making love to this person. And we don't know what he means by that, but we can assume what we want to assume. And there you have love as a way of healing, because it actually kept him going. It helped him to survive. So words can do good and they can do harm. Does everybody believe words can do harm? Sticks and stones can break my bones, but names can never hurt me. We say that. As my wife Joan points out, that's a poem to reassure people who've already been hurt by words. Right? And so it's possible to hurt people by words. Think of bullying in the schools and how badly that affects the lives of the people who are the victims, sometimes even resulting in suicide. In political circumstances, rising politicians use the power to throw a name at somebody and keep calling them that name and keep calling them that name until they have to defend themselves. And when they defend themselves, they've lost their power. So they can do harm, but it can also do good. So the power to name is something that poets always do. We have mysteries in our lives. We want to get closer to the mysteries. We call upon the poet. In the clinical situation with illness, it always works better for the patient if they have a name to attach to their problem, even if it means that the outcome is not so good. They can at least say it's my liver instead of I don't know or nobody knows. So there's a sense of reassurance that comes from getting a name. But there's also implied in various histories of ours a very strong power to the ability to give names to things. In Northern Ireland, a couple of centuries ago, if you had a vermin infestation in your house, who do you call? Not Ghostbusters. You call the bard. Who's the bard? The bard is the poet. What does the bard do? The bard comes and stands on the hill and yells names at the vermin. And keeps doing that until they go away. We can believe that or not, but it was believed then and it was used. The poets got a lot of business by doing this kind of work. Everybody knows if you're going to be a poet, you have to have a side business of some kind. So the power to put the name on something gives you mastery over it, gives you control over it, gives you control over anxiety, gives you control over the illness that you're on, to some extent anyway. And so that power to name things is always critically important to us, and the poets have spent their lives trying to do it. So I want to talk a little bit now about courage. Because it takes courage to write poetry, it takes courage to read poetry, it takes courage to stand up and recite poetry. And if you don't have courage, the poetry is not going to work very well. I give workshops in poetry around the country, and people will bring poems, and they'll be working beautifully well. They'll have a nice rhythm to them. The iambs are there, or the trochees are there, or whatever you want to do in the way of analyzing the rhythm is there. The images are beautiful. The line breaks are rhythmical and appropriate. And then you get to a certain point in the poem, and it falls apart. So what has happened at that point where the poem quits? If you look at it closely, it's the precise point at which the poet has failed to have the courage to go into the heart of a difficult truth. Which means that the organicity of the poem, the mechanisms we use to write a poem, are connected directly to truth-telling. And when it comes time to tell a hard truth, you have to do it, or the mechanisms will abandon you. Why else would they have been selected over thousands of years that we now use in the process of writing a poem? Except that they are connected to the exploration of truth. Lala, who was a Kashmirian poet, said it this way. It's the 13th century. She said, "I didn't trust it for a moment, the wine of my own poetry, but I drank it anyway. And it gave me the power to tear down darkness and cut it into little pieces." That's a lot of power. And darkness is what we are dealing with often. In illness, in psychiatry, in our lives, in our politics. All these things have darkness to them. And what we end up having to deal with is a way of working with that darkness. But it takes courage to go there. And if we don't go into it, there's interesting work by Pennebaker. Do you know about this? He's a psychology professor at the University of Texas. And what he did was to believe, I think, that he could do psychiatry by having people write. But it wasn't just any writing. It was writing about trauma in their lives. And he would sit them down for 20 minutes, 3 times in 1 week, and he would say, write about a traumatic event in your life. Everybody's got one. But don't just write about the details, write about your emotional response to it. And he compared that to other groups writing about other things, like your shopping list for Costco, or how many things you have on your wall that you can remember in your bedroom. And he found that those people who wrote those difficult ones were a little disturbed for a day or two, thinking about the hard things they had to think about to do that writing. But after that, They had air under their feet. They felt better. They performed better in school. They showed up less often at the doctor's office. They got less episodes of cold and flu. And if you started analyzing their T-cell responses, their T-cell responses were better. So that tells us that there is a connection between writing, between understanding our traumas, which oftentimes poetry and stories are all about, and the changes in our physiology that have to do with the maintenance of our health and also improvement of disease. Because they took that same technique and applied it to people in the middle of an asthma attack, and they moved more air. And they applied it to people who had AIDS, and they actually improved their T-cell response. So there is a connection. So what I'm going to do now is tell you a story that I like to say is a story that proves that poems heal. We'll come back to this picture. The story that I'm going to tell you is in the book Bedside Manners that we published with Random House in 2005. So a woman comes to see me who has symptoms of ulcer disease. I'm a gastroenterologist. So she had the usual things, the burning, the eructation, the belching, and so forth. And she had tried some remedies on her own to get it fixed, and it didn't work. And she came to see me, and I suggested some other remedies, and they didn't work. And so it came time to find out more information, right? We weren't getting anywhere. We needed to know more. So endoscopy is the next step. You put the tube down, you look at the stomach, you take a biopsy, you find objective information you can work with. So turns out she has a morbid fear of endoscopy. Absolutely morbid. And so discovering that, we had a little conversation, and we talked about what endoscopy entailed, and she had the courage to actually show up at the endoscopic suite, change, sit on the table, but when she hit the table, she freaked out. She started sweating, she started tachycardia, she started shaking. Well, you cannot do anything in a situation like that. To do so would be abuse. So we sat and talked for a little while, and then there was a period of silence. And after a couple of minutes, she said to me, "You are a poet, aren't you?" Well, my brain just went wonk, because I was thinking about Versed and biopsy and histology and anesthesia, and she says poetry. So I could feel my brain shift, and it took me a minute. I said, "Yes, okay, I am, I guess, a poet." And she said to me, she said, "If you could say a poem to me, I think I could do this." Huh? Where did that come from? Intuition. She had an intuition that said to her that if she could hear a poem, she could get the courage to do this. And so I said to her, at that point, I did not know many poems by heart. In fact, I only knew one. But since then, I've learned it's important to have them. So I've memorized a lot of poems. So I said, "I only know one. It happens to be one that I wrote. Is that okay?" And she said, "Fine." And so I said to her this poem. "My son brings me a stone and asks which star it fell from. He is serious, and so I must be careful. Even though I know he will place it among those things that will leave him someday, and he will go on gathering. For this is one of those moments that turns suddenly towards you, opening as it turns. As if for an instant we paused on the edge of a heartbeat and then pressed forward, conscious of the fear that runs beside us, and how lovely it is to be with each other in the long, resilient mornings." So when I finished that, I knew I had done everything that I could do, and the rest was not up to me. She took a couple of deep breaths and she said, okay, let's do this. She lay down, we did the test. 5 minutes later, we had a diagnosis. And the diagnosis was Helicobacter pylori, or the ulcer bacteria, which was the reason we weren't doing any good for her. So we treated her with antibiotics and she got well. And I will say to you that it was the poem that cured her. Right? Because if she hadn't asked for the poem, we wouldn't know what to do. So that got me interested. And so I decided to do a little experiment. And what I did was to go through the Human Experimentation Committee in those days, get the approval, and I tried to pick out a situation in my practice which was steeped with anxiety. That's not hard to do because I'm a gastroenterologist and I do things. And so there's not much more anxiety producing, I think, than turning 50 years of age, having your doctor say it's time for your colonoscopy, at which point you take this thing in which you pass your brains out of your system the night before, show up the next day to meet this surly gastroenterologist who's going to cram a tube up your butt and fill you full of air. So what I did was, in the preparation packet that told them what to do to get ready for the test, I put 6 poems in one packet and then not in the other. And we randomized this, so we didn't know who got what. And then we measured things. The usual measurements like blood pressure and pulse and things like that, they didn't tell us anything, and that was predictable. But we had an anxiety scale that we used to measure the level of anxiety at that one point in time. And there was a strong trend toward lower anxiety in the people who had been exposed to poems. They didn't know they were going to be exposed. They just showed up. And they read them or they didn't, or whatever magic it is about the poems present in that packet seemed to have to make a difference. Well, we ran out of money and didn't finish the study, but it was good enough for me to show that that was the improvement that was happening. And so what I did was to take those poems, pasted them into a booklet, and put them in my waiting room. And I can tell you that it worked better than a fish tank. Because when the people came to see me, they already were relaxed. They already felt better. They had a sense of confidence, even the new patients, almost a sense of trust. Now, I tried to analyze what had happened to make that poem work so well in that patient of mine. And I thought, well, was it the rhythms, that imitated the rhythms of the heart or the rhythms of natural breathing that made her comfortable? Was it the fact that I used resilient in the last line? Was it the fact that a doctor could actually say a poem and show a side that has a humanistic quality in a situation where there's science going on? I don't know. And the problem is, I don't really care, because the mystery of what that is part of the attraction to it. Because that's what writing and poems do, is to deal with the mystery that's in our lives. Science and literature have different ways of looking for what they each call truth. Science wants something that's predictable, that you can introduce into a system and it will change on a predictable basis. And to do that, they narrow things down to a point to be able to discover that. Poetry, on the other hand, uses the fewest words it possibly can to say the most in the universe about it. And so you cannot apply analytic qualities or approaches to something like a poem or a story. And so I just gave up on trying to decide that. And everybody has a certain intuition about poetry. After 9/11, the sales of poetry skyrocketed. After this last election, the hits on poetry sites around the country skyrocketed. When you have stressful times, you rely upon poetry. My sons, both when they were 3 or 4 years of age in their beds, would ask me for a story at nighttime. Maybe they had a hard day. Maybe somebody called them a name. Maybe they had to encounter some adult idea that's difficult, like suffering or death. Intuitively, they knew to ask for a story. Growing up is not easy or fair, and sometimes there are difficulties along the way. But they knew instinctively that there was something in a story that would heal or assuage or lull. And it did. So I think that we all are equipped with our attachment to words and forms of words that mean poetry and stories. Some patients, though conscious that their condition is perilous, recover their health simply through their contentment with the goodness of the physician. Goodness of the physician. Sounds far-fetched, particularly in a scientific age, but I've seen it happen. He is the best physician who's the best inspirer of hope. One of the worst things you can say as a physician is, I can't do anything for you anymore. Or it's all in your head. Both of which are wrong. There's always something that can be done. There's always something that can be looked into. So the sick are they that we deal with, and their suffering is more than one kind. It's physical, we know, but the mental, of course, the spiritual, the alienation, the fear of death, the loss of a sense of meaning in their lives. It's that darkness that comes in at that time. Hirata said that suffering could be described as separation. Separation from health, separation from others, separation from your past, the person that you used to be. That illness has a tendency to isolate the person, creating distance. And if you encounter a cold and distant physician or nurse or health practitioner, it can exacerbate the sense of suffering that one is going through. Frankl said, not destroyed by suffering, but suffering without meaning. Poetry and stories give us meaning, or at least try to. There's two longings that have been described as the most important ones in our lives, and that is to love and to be loved. To be a self already means to be alone, because we're isolated within our own bodies from the rest of the people. But when we're in love, when we have sex, when we create a family and friendships, in this convivial way, we transcend our isolation. But sickness comes along and threatens to sever all of that, and so it deepens our level of suffering. So hope, encouragement, goodness can work to modify our suffering. And because stories and poems give us a sense of meaning, and because they demand from us an expression of our humanity, they can be important in this particular situation. Now, Jack Houlihan, who is a poet and a physician at Stony Brook in New York, has put forward this article in which he believes that poetry has the power to influence healing. It has the power to modulate interactions between the healer and the patient, and that it captures and transforms the patient's experience. That's important, because their experience is not always a very good one. And he points out that the essential nutrient, he feels, of poetry is a desire to discover meaning. Now, today's orthodoxy sometimes, in some places, is exactly the opposite, because it encourages this concept of imaginative distance, where there is this fear of becoming too engaged with the patient, because there's the fear that you might compromise your objectivity, your capacity to make a correct decision for someone in distress. I have to say my experience has been exactly the opposite. That the more I get to know a patient, the closer I feel to that patient, the better I'm equipped to make the right decision. Because as healthcare providers, we are not only the ones to provide science to them, we have to find a way for science to enter their lives, which means we may have to modulate science in the way we describe it in order for people to be able to accommodate it. because they come to us already with their beliefs, their histories, their traumas, their backgrounds, their fears. They may not like the idea of getting an x-ray. They may not ever want to get chemotherapy, no matter what. They may have all of these things that knowing about or feeling about, we're better able to administer to in the process. But here we have John Berger, who has this photographic essay of the fortunate man, a masterpiece of witness, in which he describes the individual and closely intimate recognition of the physician for the patient. Recognition. It's good to be recognized. It's good to feel like somebody knows who you are. And what it does in this situation means that the hopeless nature of one's unhappiness can be changed for the better. So that process also inevitably includes some recognition on its own. The doctor is the drug, perhaps. It's possible. So how are we doing with that? One way to look at how successful we are is to find out how many complaints we get. Now, it's interesting in putting together this slide, which is really a composite of a number of different studies that looked at satisfaction among patients with their medical care. It's interesting to note that for the scientific side, they were pretty satisfied. For the most part, they thought the science was good. Occasionally not. But what they complained about was that the humanity was bad. They didn't like the way they were treated. They didn't like the way they got admitted to the hospital, how they came out, the rudeness of the people who had dealt with them. And so, 47% of patients who were hospitalized felt their physicians were not empathetic or caring. 90% couldn't name a treating physician. And surprising to me is 34% in the general medical practice, where people have a chance to get to know you over time. The opportunity is there. Because there's nothing like seeing someone on a regular basis to remind you the importance of this kind of interaction that you can have with patients and how much it matters in their outcomes. So it's true, patients are more likely to complain about the style of medical practice than its excellence. Of note, patients don't sue very often if they're satisfied, even if they recognize that there's a mistake. Happens in Ireland too. The satisfaction is on the rise. All right. So here's a slide which shows a composite of information about a variety of different outcomes that are influenced by just the word, did you connect with your doctor or did you not? And those who felt they connected had better controlled blood pressure, had adherence to their regimen, their management was closer to target, it was better with lower drug use, fewer return visits, less medical, and so forth and so on. Look at all those things. They all were better just by having that one sense that said, I feel like I'm connected. So it's not just about being nice, it actually has an impact upon our outcomes as treating physicians. Here's some data on love and healing. Love and communication as healing influences. Effective physician-patient communication, and I should say this works for all medical professionals, has favorable outcomes. The outcomes that were positively affected in descending order of frequency: emotional health, symptom resolution, function, blood pressure, blood sugar level, pain control. This then saying, did you communicate? Did your physician communicate with you? And now this one of the hard to describe business of love. A study, this reviewed, I think, about 30 different papers on love. And what they reviewed was the presence of love relationships in the lives of their patients. Okay? So they were involved with a social network. They had a loving relationship at home. And those had outcomes that were strongly favorable. It also seemed to protect them to some extent from a variety of illnesses. They had less frequent onset of a group of illnesses, including cancer, heart attack, hypertension, prolonged labor and delivery, poor T-cell responses, and poor responses to chemotherapy. Very interesting. that these things that are not scientifically measurable can have such an effect. Yeah. Well, the Dalai Lama weighs in on love, you might say. Okay, so to be fair, there are impediments to the practice of medicine that get in our way. Insurance companies are practicing medicine without a license, right? They tell you essentially they're not going to pay for something. If they don't pay for it, it's not going to get done. They're superseding the decision of the physician to decide that this drug is better than that drug or that needs this test as opposed to that test. And so there's that stress and tension within the practice of medicine these days. The capitalization of medicine, medicine by protocol, the pressure to hurry up and turn out a certain number of visits in a period of time. The patient becomes increasingly viewed as a client, as a unit of service. The depersonalization of medicine takes place. And of course, this. This is how patients feel about it. Because before, when they came to see their doctor, they actually talked to the doctor. Now, they're talking to someone who's on a computer. So the patients don't like it. And it's hard to make the adjustment to be a physician or a healthcare provider and use the computer and at the same time give the right attention to the patient. But doctors don't like it either. Here's a group of doctors in Boston who are decrying the electronic medical records. What do they say? It's like texting while driving. That it sucks the soul out of medicine to be on the computer while you're talking to somebody. So there are problems. But we can't use that as an excuse, right? So now I'm going to tell you this story. This is John Carboni, who was my mentor, gastroenterologist, loved by everyone, had a terrific practice of medicine. Patients loved him. He admitted a patient to the hospital one afternoon. He walked across the street to go visit that patient. He comes into the room, and the medical student is sitting by the bedside, taking the 1.5 to 2 hour long history and physical exam. It shows up in the chart and is of value, but is arduous. And so Carboni comes in and he excuses himself, and he sits down on the bedside, which is one of those things that people advise us not to do. But he does it. And they have a little conversation. They talk about the San Francisco Giants, who this year suck. But in those years, there were some good ones. They talked about the Giants. They talked about fishing. And then after about 5 minutes, he reaches over and he touches the guy on the sleeve and he says, "Now, Mr. Johnson, I don't want you to worry about the surgery tomorrow. Everything's going to be all right." And he turns around and he walks out of the room. And the medical student the patient turns to the medical student and says, "Isn't that Dr. Carboni wonderful? He spends so much time with his patients." Now, the medical student had been there for 1.5 hours, an eternity. And Carboni gets all the credit. Why? Because Carboni had it. He had presence. He was present in his interactions with his patients. He wasn't distracted by the chart or by the computer or by the insurance company or anybody. He was present. Which brings up, to my mind anyway, Tolstoy's 3 questions. What's the most important time? Now. Who's the most important person? The one you're with. What's the most important thing to do? To do good for that person. Now I'll tell you a story from my own practice, which is also in one of the books. So this patient comes with headaches. I do a little internal medicine also. So she shows up with headaches. She had had headaches for about 15 years, had seen a lot of doctors, had a lot of studies done, spent a lot of money, still had her headaches. She got so sick and tired of her headaches that she gave up. She said, I'm never going to see another doctor. And somebody forced her to come and see me. And the moment she walked in the room, I knew that I needed to just listen to what she had to say. How much time do you think it takes for the average doctor-patient interview to be interrupted by the doctor as the patient is trying to tell her story? 13 seconds. You can't say much in 13 seconds. And furthermore, you're going to lose the narrative thread that will take you to places you could not go. You see, she had already seen a bunch of doctors. What she told me was the time of day, what she was doing, the medications at work, the studies she's had, all the information she told all the other doctors, which meant I was not going to make any difference because I had the same information to work from. So I let her talk until she was dry. It took about 5 minutes. And then, you see, because it was what she had regurgitated to all of her other doctors, I didn't know what to ask. And so I didn't say anything. And the title of this story is Silence Asks the Right Question. Because after about a minute, which seemed like a long time, she sat up, she dusted a little bit of flotsam off of her dress, and she said, you know, something happened to me last week. I do not understand. And I said, what? She said, well, I was going to visit my accountant on the 13th floor of the Bank America building, and I realized for the first time in my life, I did not want to get in the same elevator with my husband. And then she looks at me, and she says, what do you think that means? And that's a dangerous moment. I've known this woman 7.5 minutes, and I'm going to tell her what that means? I think everybody in this room has a notion what that means. She didn't know, or thought she didn't know. But in the moment that she had the opportunity to speak in a non-judgmental audience about something that had been bothering her, but she suppressed, it came forth. And I said, which was true, I do not know. But sounds important, and I think you should think about it. So she goes away, comes back 2 weeks later. She's rented a storage vault, moved her furniture out, started divorce proceedings. Right? And she looks at me and she says, you did that. I said, I did not. All I did was hear you say what you apparently needed to do. Now that cure of a headache took 7.5 minutes. Did not involve any expensive tests. And the only thing it was listening. Giving the opportunity for the important stuff to be said. So these two stories, I think, counteract some of those things we like to use as excuses. To say, well, it's the EMR, or it's the insurance company, or it's the... We still have the capacity to engage people, to make the contact. And that makes all the difference in the outcomes. So what is the problem? What's the disconnect? Oh, Mark Twain has an idea. He says, I have never let my schooling interfere with my education. Is it the problem of our schooling that matters? Is that how we end up in the problem? This one has a drop of my own blood on the page. Now, poets and writers need to do that, because if they don't, the stories aren't worth very much. I think it's Hemingway that says, writing is easy. You just sit down at your typewriter and bleed. So this is an article I wrote for the New England Journal, and it's entitled, Cure for the Common Cold. And I'm not talking about a virus. I'm talking about the cold and distant physician. And I start with a story about myself. So here I am, a third year, in the Bintab ER rotation, in the middle of the night, sleep deprived, angry, without any knowledge that I'm doing anything any good for anybody. And this overweight, alcoholic, repetitive, recidivist patient comes in. And I'm looking at this unconscious mass of humanity on the gurney and thinking, why can't he take care of himself? Why does he have to do this? Why does he have to trouble us with this, with causing us while we could be taking care of somebody who has a laceration or is having a stroke? We have to come and take care of him. And I lost it. And I found myself yelling at him, saying things I didn't know I had, nor felt. And when I had ventilated myself completely, I stepped back a little bit and I ran into somebody, and that person was the man's father, who had witnessed the whole thing. And I immediately recognized my error. And I wondered what had happened to the fair-haired young boy who came to medical school hoping to save the world and reduce suffering in the world. What happened to that person in that moment? There's a study of all things that shows that we lose it in the third year. Here's a study that uses a scale which was developed to measure the ability for compassion. Okay? And what they did was to test medical students at different points. The first point on the left-hand side is when they matriculate. The second point's the end of the first year. The third point's end of the second year. And the fourth point is the end of the third year. Their scores on this compassion scale. And you see how it dives down. Now, I have to admit, and we all knew this anyway, that the women do a lot better than the men. That top number is the women, and the bottom one is the men in the medical school. Now, they recover a little bit by the fourth year, but not a heck of a lot. And you could say, well, I don't trust the methodology. Who knows what compassion is? How can they measure this? But they've done this study at more than one place. Here's Arkansas, same thing. Different scale, similar numbers. And then it's confirmed again by Boston University in their work. So we have these situations. But look at this. I participate as a judge in the National Poetry Contest for medical students called the DeBakey Contest. And this is one of this year's entrants. I cannot say how she came out because it hasn't been announced yet. But this poem captured my interest. Because look what she does. First, we learned a heartbeat by taking it apart and naming it. We studied valves as if they were pipes. What makes them rust or clog? And then we marveled how intricate the machinery, how precise the clockwork, as if we had built it ourselves. How do you explain what it means to miss someone? Loss is not a kitchen appliance. It does not come with an instruction manual for how to clip and trim the tendrils of your soul that curve around another person's fingertips. We were naive. We imagined that we could learn the architecture of grief simply by examining blueprints. We did not realize then that you cannot describe how to weed a garden until you yourself have tried to uproot a dandelion and felt the ground surge in response. Abigail wrote this at the end of her first year of medical school. And I think it depicts beautifully the struggle to integrate the science of medicine and the humanity of medicine, and how difficult that is to learn how to accomplish that task. When I read this poem, I contacted her and asked if we could use this poem, and she gave permission to do so, and I immediately sent her an anthology of poems. And I'm going to follow her to see what happens in her third year. The anthology that I sent her, by the way, is this one, which I have collected. It starts with the 6 poems that I used in my poetry study that worked to relieve anxiety. It continues through the poems that I added to it on a year-by-year basis in my outer office until I had enough for an anthology. And it is the book that I have used to teach poetry classes at the Fromm Institute now for several years. And I have put this book now in my waiting room, and it does the same kind of work. And so I have sent it around to all my friends who have practices of medicine, and they have it in their examining rooms and in their waiting rooms. And the reports are that it's helping out. Medical school is a transformative experience. It probably has something to do with the way we train them, and I'm going to say that it has to do with the alterations that we make in their brains as the process of education. This is a study, by the way, this slide you can prove almost anything with. I don't think you can see those red dots very well, but that's the hippocampus. And what they did in London was to look at cabbies who were trained in the map of London. And after the training in the map of London for a year and a half before they could drive their first and take their first client, their hippocampus expanded, which is the part of the brain that has to do with the registration of maps. And so not only was their thinking biochemically, electrochemically changed, but there was a hypertrophy of the brain itself to the task it was given. So if we translate that into the education of physicians and nurses, we are transforming their brain electrochemically, maybe even in terms of the actual volume of parts of the brain that attend to the various functions that we expect from them. And that means that we are expecting great science, and we don't have high expectations for humanity. And it happens in physicists as well. And here we are. We need to be educating the heart. All right. I'm just going to say that the solution to the problem is not more lectures on compassion. The most boring lecture I ever sat through was a lecture on compassion. Because the guy was talking about how you position your body when you're talking to the patient, how you make eye contact, when you raise the eyebrow, when you reach out and touch the elbow. He was talking about external manifestations, which really have very little to do with the compassion. Because I've known doctors who have all those manifestations and they're not compassionate at all. And I've known other doctors who have none of those and they make lasting connections to their patients. So it comes from in here. If you have it in here, it doesn't matter what's out there. If you don't have it in here, it still doesn't matter what's out there. It's how you work from the inside. And that's how you raise this business of goodness that Hippocrates was talking about. We all have it. We just sometimes forget how to use it. And what I want to know is how do we awaken it? So I'm going to just talk you through the rest of my talk. Role models are the best way to show how to do it because you can watch and assimilate or reject certain behaviors you don't like. But role models have been marginalized in medical education these days because it's all research-based, or at least that's where the rewards are. Because the NIH grants are based upon research, the appointments, the advancement in your career is based upon academics and science. Nothing wrong with that. Those are great people and they make a tremendous service to us, both in the presence of the science and otherwise. If we don't have the science, we're nothing but a bunch of quacks masquerading as helping hands. So we have to have the science. I have no argument with that. But we have neglected the humanity side. And so what I think we need to do is, because literature and poems have the ability to register humanistic qualities, and because they can serve as a role model, because you can become engaged with a story, you can become involved and inside of that story. You're actually being a participant in the observation of things which teach you about how to manifest compassion and connection and all those things. So to expose medical students and nursing students to stories, to poems, and discuss them on a regular basis. Now, I'm fond of saying that the pathway to the curriculum committee is littered with corpses, because you can't get a knife in edgewise. Everybody wants more time. And the reason is there's more information to be taught. And it's legitimate. But I show up at the curriculum committee, which I have done, trying to many times. Nobody wants to hear about making poems or stories available. But there's something about this that is critical. There's a process called vivid imagining, so that when you are in a story and listening to that story, if you imagine that story deeply enough, and a good writer will make you do that, then you are not just watching the story, you're a participant. And if you are a participant, you are recording the information you get, not just as memory, but as experience. So the next time that encounter comes to you, you already have the information that you need, or part of it, because you feel like you've been there before, even though you haven't. So it's a way of introducing to medical and nursing students and healthcare professionals a way that they can learn this when the role models are not necessarily around. Now, William Carlos Williams said, Dr. William Carlos Williams said, the news is hard to get from poetry, but men and women die miserably every day for lack of what is found there. That news might have been important to that third-year medical student in the Bintab ER in the middle of the night. Thank you very much.
Dr. Watts, thank you for this really great talk. I teach college freshmen who want to go into healthcare in some way, shape, or form, and then I kind of follow them throughout their college journey, and I noticed this trend that the ones who sort of get this and have the empathy and the compassion end up going into public health or going into physician assistant schools or going into social work because they're not hard scientists, and that's what you need to be nowadays to get into medical school. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how we train the next generations of physicians when there's sort of these conflicting factors.
I think that we're all capable of it all. And that, if you think about brain function with the DLPFC, which is controlling daytime thinking in a linear process, and that linear process is where science is learned and practiced and works best. Although intuition is also important in science, by the way. That is the dominant way in which we think in a daytime operation. If we become creative, the DLPFC shuts down and the default network takes over. And that is not a single location like the DLPFC is, but it is a scattering of brain activity. So if you would take a jazz musician and you say, play Bach's air on a G string, they'll play it and the DLPFC will light up. If you say improvise, the DLPFC shuts down and the default network, which is connected to the deeper aspects of consciousness and therefore emotional stream and therefore compassion and all of those creative things that are important to our lives. That's what happens. So the jazz musician can go back and forth. Now, people who are born completely creative probably don't have much of a DLPFC. They probably operate almost entirely out of their default network. But you take people who are hard scientists, or people who are pilots, or people who are accountants, they're running out of the DLPFC. But you see, I think that in the process of education, particularly in the healthcare sciences, we're not just interested in science. We come to medical school or nursing school because we want to help people, because we want to cure, we want to relieve suffering. So we have that already. What I think happens is the process of the education doesn't pay enough attention to nourish it, and it dies. There's a poem which I didn't have time to recite, but I refer you to it. It's The Panther. It's written by Rilke. Rilke was an apprentice to Rodin. And Rodin said to Rilke, if you want to write a poem, you have to look at something for days at a time. And he sent Rilke out to the zoo. And Rilke stood in front of the panther cage for day after day after day before writing a single word. And when he wrote the words, he wrote this wonderful poem about, it starts, from seeing the bars, his seeing is so exhausted that it can hardly hold anything anymore. To him, life is only bars, 10,000 bars. And behind the bars, nothing. It's the first stanza. There are two more. That is a technique that we can use in medicine, is getting into the patient and seeing from the inside out. There's a technique, that technique has a name. It's called Einsehen, which is a German name for seeing from within. And it is the idea that was put forward by Theodor Lipp, the German philosopher. And it's been imitated in other ways, but when you think about it, if we develop that capacity to be able to look into, how can we administer to the suffering of others if we don't know the universe in which they live? We have to understand that to be able to say, here's what you need to do, or here's how I can tell you what needs to happen. We have all this, and all we need, I think, is the proper encouragement along the way. You could assign a poem on Monday. You could have pizza on Friday noon and discuss the poem with someone who knows about poetry, knows about literature, knows about compassion. And it'd probably be enough to keep the balance between these two forces that are operating in our brains. I think I probably didn't answer your question. But once I get started, I think I would not discourage people from going on into medicine who feel that they, it's difficult to get into medical school. You have to score well enough to do it. And I sat on the admissions committee at UCSF for a number of years, and I always assumed that anybody who was sitting across the desk from me was already highly intelligent and already performing very well. I didn't need to know about that. What I wanted to know, what kind of person they were. What were their experiences? How do they relate to other people? What can they tell me that is their passion? Do they have a passion in life? Things like that. So those people we need in medicine, I'd say.
Let me redirect outside any further questions. My favorite caterer, Emily, is out there waiting for us. So thank you.